This video is a closer look at some of the features of PlanePrint's reimagining of a paper airplane. It has certainly tried to be faithful down to the printed creases in the paper. I've seen descriptions that its flight characteristics are unusual to say the least, as the paper airplanes that we used to fold and chuck out there, well, there's no conventional rudder. PlanePrint have, however, adopted the motor mount to allow a vector control of the prop. On their videos, it's implied that this can be used so that masterful pilots can make the beastie dance. I'm not a master pilot. The motor mount and the servo driving it are certainly fragile. Essentially, anything less than a perfect landing will crack the motor arm. In an earlier video, I mentioned that I beefed up the motor arm, and I've also designed a skid to keep the motor somewhat above the ground during landing. So, let's take a closer look. From the top, the three servos and the electrics are placed in the V of the fuselage. Space is very tight. Don't glue those servos in. First, run the wires to the receiver position and do some test fits of the servos, the servo supports, the control rods, and the initial setups in your transmitter and receiver before you fix the position of those servos. You might need to adjust the depth of the servo mounts to get the servo arm to fit nicely within the slots of the fuselage. Looking from below, the servo arms include printed extensions that pass through slots in the fuselage. You might have to adapt the printed servo arms STL files that PlanePrint includes to match your particular servo arm. I ended up filing the slots to open them up to keep them from binding in use. As the servos are near the center of gravity, there's a rather long linkages to the elevons. I found that a single guide of the carbon fiber rods led to deflections of the rod, so I duplicated the guides. Here's a somewhat difficult to read image of the OpenTX inputs. The full throws are quite exuberant, so I set a 60% rate for the aileron and elevator sticks. Note that the rudder has been set to listen to the aileron stick. Officially, one would drive the motor vector by way of the rudder stick, but I'm not going there. Here's the mixer page in OpenTX. The positive and negatives combine to convert the separate elevator and aileron sticks to the elevons in the paper airplane. In this particular case, the rudder mix, I've given a 10 to 15% weighting. Here's what the OpenTX channel monitor shows when the aileron and elevator sticks are exercised. There's a little bit of a bar that shows up for channel 4. And this is what the motor vector looks like with those inputs and mixes. Seemed to me like it was about a 3-degree swing to the left or right. Looking from below, we can see that the control surfaces, well, they're hardly small, and the carbon fiber rod has a long way to go. Make sure that it runs freely in the guides, and also that the rod connectors are not so tight that they bow the rod when the servo is actuating. When we look at the other side, it's possible to see the small movement of that forward servo driving the motor mount. With the prop live, here's another view of that motor vector in operation. But certainly, even with a perfect landing, you want to make sure you're using a prop saver. Out in the field, I wanted to double check some of the issues I'd found in earlier flights. Yeah, its turning characteristics earlier were not very great. And I was probably a little bit under throttled. Let's look at it in real time on this test flight. It's short and ran mostly to plan, which was to shoulder launch just shy of full throttle, gradually come about, gain some altitude, level, and then try a sharp turn, see if I could ease that back into a lazy turn, reduce the throttle, and then see what the landing process was like. Hopefully with just a little bit of feather before landing. Okay, now at half speed. Yes, the throttle level worked, although there was some wobble during the initial turn. It did gain altitude and leveled off much better than earlier flights, and it took minimum stick to do that. And there was a sufficient speed for that extreme bank and it did actually transition nicely into a lazy turn. The partial power feather was a little bit early, but otherwise it was a very nice soft landing. So I did this test with 60% rates and a 60% expo. Some of you might find that you would want to change those rates in expos. Again, the stick movements were actually quite constrained during this test.